right, good morning, folks. So we're going to get started here today talking about the years of crisis, which is the period of time between 1919 and 1939, and there's going to be four major sections to this PowerPoint as we move through it. The first one's going to be talking about the post-war, and when I say post-war, I'm talking World War I, post-war uncertainty. And that's really what we're going to be focusing largely on for today's class. However, as we progress throughout the rest of this PowerPoint here, we're going to talk about how the Great Depression set in the late 20s. We're going to be talking about how fascism, which is extreme nationalism, rises in Europe. And we're going to be looking at eventually some of these hostile, aggressive nations beginning to invade other nations and take them over. And that's ultimately what ends up leading to World War II. So just looking at the first section today on post-war uncertainty, and sometimes they call this period of time the interwar years from 1919 to 1939, the years of crisis, because seemingly the world is trying to, on one hand, become more democratic, while on the other hand, strong men are vying for power and trying to dismantle democracy. And so you see totalitarian dictators like Hitler, Mussolini in Italy, Stalin in Russia come to power during this time. And that's part of the crisis. But the other part of the crisis that we have to consider is that at the end of World War I, you guys have to understand that World War I was a culturally devastating event. Okay? When we talk about World War I, these days, it kind of pales in comparison to World War II. Certainly since that time, a lot more historians have focused on World War II than World War I. But, you know, World War I was very, very important at the time that it was that it happened. And in World War I, at the end of it, because there had been such devastation and such death, not to mention the Spanish flu epidemic that took place and all these other things, you have to understand that at the end of it, people were really forced to take a hard look in the mirror, you know, and ask themselves some questions about you know, life, basically. You know, we have a tendency to forget just how devastating the war was to people and how gruesome the war was by comparison to any war that had ever come before it. World War I left people shell-shocked with post-traumatic stress disorder. It left people horribly disfigured from terrible wounds in the battlefield that they incurred. And they're coming home from the war, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the direction of Europe after this in particular. Think about this for a second. You know, when we talk about World War I, Europeans for centuries, by the time that World War I broke out, Europeans for centuries had been calling themselves the most, you know, the most civilized, the most rational, the most enlightened people on the planet. And they had been going around to the rest of the world and converting people to Christianity and taking over distant places and making them into colonies and subduing the people that lived in these colonies and exploiting slave labor and all of these things in the name of European supremacy for centuries. Okay, for centuries this had been going on. And then World War I happens, a war between these allegedly civilized nations who had gone around for centuries taking everywhere else over in the name of how much better they were than everyone else. And then World War I, they're fighting against one another for literally no reason at all, basically. And, sure, we can go back and point to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and things like that. But essentially, largely, World War I, people fighting the war are really thinking to themselves, here I am stuck in these trenches fighting World War I. I don't care about Serbia. I'm some French guy, I didn't even want to be in this war. And yet here I am fighting against a German guy who has nothing to do with Austria. And then, we're fighting it because of a Serbian dude who assassinated an Austrian dude. How did I get here? And then even beyond that, of course, many of the European nations, including the French, used their colonial subjects. So even beyond that, you would have colonial subjects from, say, Morocco or elsewhere in Africa, Algeria, you name it. And here you are, an African national, you're not even from Europe, and now you're stuck in a European trench fighting a war for Europeans who had said for years they're the most rational people on the planet, and now they're killing themselves to the tune of 10 million people for seemingly no reason at all. And so you could understand why at the end of the war people get done with it and they're like, wow, that was really crazy. That was really, really, really bad. And for what? For all this loss, for all this devastation, for all the people that were killed in the war or maimed in the war or mentally, frazzled after the war, all this death and destruction and chaos done by and against Europeans. So Europeans get done with World War I and they have a lot of soul searching to do. I thought we were rational. What's rational about fighting a war for 4 years to the tune of 10 million deaths for nothing? And so Europeans get to the end of World War I and they have a lot of questions that they have circling in their heads about the meaning of life. So the main idea for this first part of the Interwar Years unit is certainly one of loss and uncertainty because, there's so much loss from World War I and there's a lot of uncertainty about the direction that Europe's going to head in the future. But also, interestingly, it's also a time of amazing invention and creativity and new ideas. And a lot of these new ideas are coming out of the fact that Europeans are reconciling the fact that maybe they're not as rational as they thought they were. Here for centuries, Europeans, going back to the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution that we learned about last semester, Europeans had been thinking they were the most enlightened people on the planet. They had read the political philosophical works of Voltaire and Montesquieu and John Locke and all these other guys. And they thought to themselves, here we are, we're the rational ones, we're the civilized ones. Okay? And they get to the end of World War II and they're like, maybe we need to rethink some things. Maybe we're not as rational as we thought we were. Maybe we don't have it all figured out yet. And sometimes this manifests on a smaller level. We're talking on a very broad level across Europe here, where there's these new ideas and a lot of artistic and literary creativity and scientific breakthroughs and other things like that happen during these interwar years, after World War I, but before World War II. Very, very interesting time to be living. And meanwhile, the world is changing in terms of the balance of power, because after World War I, increasingly we're going to see the United States enter into the global framework as a global power, which up to this point, really, the United States had been considered this kind of weak, relatively weak backwoods nation on the other side of the planet that most Europeans weren't too concerned about or interested in. But after World War I, which we largely escaped from World War I as Americans, unscathed, because there were no battles fought in America in World War I, and Americans don't enter the war until right at the tail end of it. So America kind of comes in at the end of the war. We get to claim victory. We assist the British and the French in emerging victorious. The Allied powers defeat the Central powers in World War I, but America comes out of it pretty unscathed. And that will play a factor as well, because America in the 1920s goes through a period of time known as the Roaring Twenties. And the Roaring Twenties in America were all about jazz music and movies and new inventions with telephones and radios and other things like that. And we'll talk about some of that today. On a smaller level, if we talk about artists, or musicians, okay, or even sometimes actors or other people like that, creative professions, okay, one of the things that's really interesting is that sometimes the most beautiful pieces of art, and I include in art not only things like paintings and drawings and other things like that, but also music and film and so on. Some of the most amazingly creative and inventive and beautiful works come from people who have really had to struggle in life, right? Some of the best albums from musicians and bands in history have come from people who have really experienced true loss and true heartbreak and really difficult times. And so that's one of the things that's interesting too about the interwar years, is the whole world really is going through a difficult time during the 1920s and 30s. And precisely because they're going through that difficult time, it's also marked by this unusual connection with creativity and new ideas. And so let's talk about some of these scientific revolutions that take place in the 1920s and 30s. New ideas start to challenge the way that we looked at the world starting in the 20s, because people come out of World War I with a profound sense of uncertainty, okay? If there's any one word that I could use to describe the cultural vibe of many Europeans as well as Americans and so on during this time, it's that people are uncertain about the direction of the future, because we're seeing the world change right in front of our eyes. I mentioned to you before, at the end of World War I, we saw the downfall of 4 different empires in Europe that had been around for literally centuries. What's it going to mean for the future of Europe now that we have redrawn the borders of the European continent? We have new countries that are coming into existence after World War I. Germany and Austria's borders have been profoundly redrawn. Many of their lands have been taken away from them. New nation states have been formed, like Hungary and Yugoslavia and you name it, okay? Meanwhile, there's a revolution going on in Russia and a civil war happening in Russia, where we're seeing communism come about for the first time in Russia at the tail end of World War I. And then in a lot of places, people are questioning the strength of democratic institutions to be able to handle all of these problems in the wake of World War I's destruction. So this leads people to be questioning their traditional beliefs about things. And we see this miniature scientific revolution take place that's every bit as important as the one that took place during Galileo's time back in the early 1600s. And, you know, the most important, the most important part of the scientific revolution of the earlier days, the 15 and 1600s, was towards the tail end of the 1600s. You might remember learning about Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton wrote that piece called Principia. And Isaac Newton's work defined how physics worked for the following centuries. And it was really Isaac Newton's teachings that had been the basis for European rationalism, because people began looking during that time, people began looking at all of the different phenomena around them and trying to explain it through scientific means. You know, remember that the scientific revolution led to secularism, where people turned away from religion and explaining everything that happens around them through God, or through, you know, God either punishing people or rewarding people or the Bible or whatever. People had previously explained things using primarily their faith before the first scientific revolution. After Isaac Newton's Principia, increasingly people are trying to find logical, rational explanations, causal relationships between things, and to explain things not in a religious way, but rather in a scientific way. Well, during the 1920s and 30s, this guy by the name of Albert Einstein, you've probably heard of him before, comes about. And he's a German-born physicist, and he has all of these new ideas on space, time, energy, and matter. And essentially, all of the teachings from Isaac Newton, which we still teach today in basic physics classes. If you take physics at the high school, you will learn about Newtonian physics, because there's no simpler and more straightforward way of explaining everyday phenomena here on Earth than by using Isaac Newton's teachings. And remember, he came up with the different laws of motion. An object at rest tends to stay at rest unless acted upon by an outside force. An object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. All of these are Isaac Newton's teachings. But Albert Einstein was looking beyond that, and he realized that there were certain problems in physics that Isaac Newton's teachings were unable to answer. And so Albert Einstein goes back to the drawing board, and he comes up with brand new ideas surrounding physics that completely turn Isaac Newton's teachings on their head. And so, you know, already Max Planck, who's another physicist of this time, Max Planck had come up with quantum physics. Quantum physics completely undermines Newtonian physics, but it's also extremely advanced, and it's difficult to it's difficult to learn. Okay, you know, no one enters into basic physics and starts learning about quantum physics, because the types of problems that quantum physics solves are beyond the scope of what most people need to understand about physics. And that's why even today we still learn about Isaac Newton. However, one of the things that Albert Einstein comes up with is he realizes that light travels at the same speed no matter what, that the speed of light is a constant. Okay? On the other hand, whereas previous to Albert Einstein, people had thought that space and time were constant, Albert Einstein comes up with this new thing called the theory of relativity. And he basically says that space and time change. They are not constant. They warp according to how fast they're moving, essentially. So because the speed of light is constant, and I know that I'm kind of putting on my physics hat here, which is a hat that definitely does not fit as well as my history hat does, but just go along with it for the time being. You got to understand here that there are some wacky things that happen as things start to move towards the speed of light. So to give you an example, let me just explain to you a little bit. First of all, here's Albert Einstein. You guys have probably seen him before. And the key to Albert Einstein's theories on relative motion is this idea known as the theory of relativity. And Einstein's ideas completely changed how science, physics, and the world worked. Because after Albert Einstein's teachings, Isaac Newton's absolute laws of motion and gravity were no longer as accurate. Okay, they're no longer as valid for explaining unanswered questions. There were just certain questions that couldn't be answered by Isaac Newton's laws of motion, and that's why Albert Einstein's theory of relativity was so groundbreaking. It started to answer questions that people couldn't answer. Here's an interesting idea for you. Perhaps you've ever seen the movie Interstellar with Matthew McConaughey. Okay, the movie Interstellar with Matthew McConaughey, there's a scene in that movie where they land on a kind of like an ocean planet that's many, many, many times the size of Earth. And while they are on this planet, which has a lot more gravity, okay, and it's circling around this star a lot faster than Earth circles around the Earth, while they're on this planet, time is moving faster for Matthew McConaughey and I forget the name of the actress that's in that movie with him, but they're down on this planet only for a couple of hours. But when they get back up into space, decades and decades have passed since anyone has heard from them. And this idea is known as time dilation, okay? It's a very unusual phenomenon in physics that has to do with Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, explaining that because a person, let's say, just to give you another example, let's take it here on Earth. Let's say that there was a rocket ship invented here on Earth, and this rocket ship is capable of traveling maybe not at the speed of light, but nearly the speed of light. Okay, so let's say about, half the speed of light, which is still really, really, really fast. Okay, and it's the fastest spaceship that's ever been invented, and you go on that spaceship, and it launches into orbit around Earth, and you start traveling at half the speed of light, just orbiting around Earth at nearly the speed of light. If you were on that ship for, let's say, and I'm making these numbers up, you could actually calculate it if you wanted to. I don't know the real number, but let's say you were up there for like a few days. Okay, you're orbiting around Earth. You have your watch. It's on your wrist, and you're keeping time on your watch. Your watch will continue to still tick the same way that it does on Earth. But what would happen is after exactly, let's say, 2 days of you traveling at half the speed of light or half the speed of light rather, around Earth. When you came back and landed after 2 days of light speed travel orbiting around Earth, you know, decades and decades would have passed here on Earth, because people here would have still been traveling at not the speed of light. And so the closer you get to traveling at the speed of light, the slower time moves for you. Time is relative, it's not constant. Same with mass. That's one of the reasons that light speed travel is deemed to be impossible, is because the closer you move to the speed of light, the closer your mass moves towards, you know, growing to infinity. Okay? So space, time, mass are relative, but the speed of light is constant. And this finding by Albert Einstein was truly groundbreaking, and it completely pulled the rug out underneath physics and opened up a whole new area of questions to be asked and studied and hopefully one day answered surrounding physics. It's truly amazing stuff. And Albert Einstein, of course, was an absolute genius. And science has never been the same ever since. More recently, we've continued to expand upon Albert Einstein's teachings, and we've had a number of other amazing physicists. You guys may know of Stephen Hawking, who only died a handful of years ago. He is the famous physicist who was bound to a wheelchair. He has kind of a robot voice thing that talks to him for him, because he had, at least before he died, for years and years, Stephen Hawking had I think it was ALS, and was confined to a wheelchair and lost his ability to speak. And here you had this amazing mind in his brain, and in his head. His brain was amazing, but he was in this crippled body. And then more recently, even, of course, you may have heard of the Super Hadron Collider over in, I think it's Switzerland. And the Super Hadron Collider recently has been colliding particles together at the speed of light to see what happens when particles explode. And this is also truly groundbreaking scientific research that's happened within the last 10 years. So, after World War I, this years of crisis that got people initially asking questions about what they believed to be true about science, about physics, about the laws of the universe, and then being willing to go back to the drawing board like Albert Einstein did and say, this is wrong, let's come up with a more complete explanation, has led to a full century of new scientific developments and medical advancements, and you name it, in the time since World War I ended. So that's how physics has been changing. Let's talk about another field of science, psychology. Now, psychology, comparative to, say, chemistry or physics or other sciences, astronomy, you name it, the study of psychology is a more recent science. Sometimes it's people will tease psychologists and say that it's a soft science because it's studying human behavior and social behavior, and that's kind of harder to pin down, scientifically. But make no mistake, psychology definitely is a science, and the real groundbreaking figure from the interwar years period that we're going to be talking about in this unit is this guy, Sigmund Freud. Now, I will just start off by telling you that Sigmund Freud, in modern day times, we don't look to Sigmund Freud as really the most legitimate source that you could use to study psychology. To be completely honest with you, Sigmund Freud's teachings in our modern day times hold certainly a degree of skepticism by most psychologists in modern times, because in Freud's time things were different. There were different ideas about, there were just different cultural ideas about gender roles and things like that. He lived still in a very patriarchal, male-dominated time. All right, so a lot of Sigmund Freud's studies today are frankly pretty suspect. Okay, they're not the most reliable sources of scientific literature that you can come up with. Freud is a troubling figure when it comes to academic integrity and scientific strength of his research. Nonetheless, we still have to give Freud credit for where it's due. And the way that we give Freud credit in modern day times is that Sigmund Freud very much revolutionized the idea of kind of human behavior, okay? And he got us thinking, you have to understand that prior to the interwar years, prior to World War I, people thought that human beings were largely rational creatures, that human behavior could be explained through reason, that humans were reasonable, that they used their brains, that there was a cause for why people acted the way that they did that was studyable and understandable. Sigmund Freud says, maybe humans are not as rational as we think they are, okay? Maybe human behavior is actually quite irrational. Maybe this whole idea about humans being rational creatures who use their brains and can explain why they do things and why they say things and why they think things and all of these other explanations that would be based in reason, maybe there's a lot of things that humans do that are not based in reason. And this is the main question that Sigmund Freud begins to answer. Now, we need to understand that the kinds of people that Freud dealt with, because Freud was a physician, he was a doctor, and he treated people who had psychological problems. And because he treated people who had psychological problems, these were people who were already, I guess, for lack of a better word, troubled, okay? If not, downright ill. Mentally ill. And so he started asking people about, he started talking to people. When you think about modern day psychologists and kind of the chaise lounge and people laying down and a guy sitting there with a notepad saying, "Tell me how you feel," and all of these ideas, those are the kinds of practices that Freud implemented in his office. And what he was trying to do was to dig beneath the surface of people's brains to get at Venkata, this is not related to Imperial China. Did I say that it was? Anyhow, so during this time, Freud starts asking people questions about their dreams, and he believes in the idea that Imperial China is just another thing that's happening right around this same time. As Freud is coming up with these ideas, the stuff with Imperial China is happening over in China, okay? It's just all the same time period. And so anyhow, but the point being here that Freud thought that largely most of the things that people do are actually informed by things that they aren't even aware of, what he called the unconscious mind. Now, if you think about that word unconscious for a second, okay? the word unconscious, if somebody is unconscious, what that means is that they're not awake. They're not aware of what's going on around them. Okay? Freud thought that there, and today we're still learning more and more about the brain. And in Freud's time, there was very, very limited understanding of how the brain worked. Okay? But Freud became convinced that there was a major side to people that they were simply unaware of. And he broadly termed this part of their mind that they were not aware of called their unconscious mind. Okay? Now, if you were to do an autopsy on someone and start looking at their brain, you're not going to be looking through the brain and find a segment of their brain and be like, oh, there's the unconscious segment of their brain. That's not how it works. Okay? The point is that there are a lot of things that happen with people on a daily basis where they get into bad moods, or they may have chemical imbalances in their brain, or they may just be human beings that are influenced by parts of them that they really don't have much control over. If you think about, for example, when you enter into puberty and your endocrine system, which is a system that releases hormones into your body, and it causes you to grow, it messes with your metabolism and all of these other things, okay? Those hormones, those chemical messengers in your bloodstream can have a real profound impact on how you feel. And there's no explaining it in this time because people didn't really understand how hormones work or how neurotransmitter chemicals in the brain work. None of that has been studied in Freud's time yet. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a real effect on behavior. And so, what happens when people have hormonal imbalances is they can be cranky, they can be lethargic, they can be anxious, they can be depressed, and how do you explain that? How do you explain it? Freud explains it through what he called the unconscious mind. And he basically said that people have these kind of underlying maybe violent or aggressive or sexual motivations that they may not even really have any idea exist. And because they don't know that they exist, they would not be able to explain why they act irrationally because of these unconscious motivators, these unconscious influencers that exist within your brain and within your body. So Sigmund Freud gets people to start thinking about human behavior as not being very rational. And that's why Sigmund Freud was so significant during his time. Freud's ideas really weakened a faith in supreme human reason. That humans were not as reasonable as we previously thought they were prior to Freud's. Now, Freud's theories came around in the 1920s. His theories had widespread influence, but we also have to understand that being a man of his time in the early 1900s, a century ago, science was not where it is today back then. And so, he would often treat patients with, for example, cocaine, which he himself was also addicted to. And I don't have to explain that that's not good, okay, obviously. But again, kind of getting back to this idea that that people who have mental or behavioral problems can be treated with pharmaceuticals. And that's another way in which the study of psychology changes after Freud, is that increasingly after Freud, there is more of a focus put onto using medications to to change people's behaviors and thinking processes, away from perhaps destructive or maladaptive ones. And Arnav, I would say that the cocaine worked to probably, do what cocaine does, which is negatively affect your health. But there's a reason that these days cocaine would not be prescribed by a doctor, and that's because it's more harmful than it is helpful, right? So of course, these days that would be completely unprofessional, and you would probably lose your medical license for doing something like that. No, Victoria, that's a different guy. That guy is a guy by the name of Munoz, I think is his name. Is that who it was? Yes, Antonio Moniz, that's who it is, Moniz. Okay, this guy right here. This was the guy who came up with psychosurgery, where they were performing brain surgeries on people and doing lobotomies and severing parts of the brain from each other and stuff like that. So that was Moniz is his name. Okay, and so this is the guy who kind of came up with that whole thing. All right. Anyhow, good question. Moving on. Another way. So we've talked about how physics has changed. We've now talked about how psychology has started to change. Let's take a look at literature. During the 1920s, there were a number of literary figures, writers, who began to express doubts about traditional religious beliefs and cultural beliefs in Europe. So, for example, in 1922, T.S. Eliot described the world, the post-war world, as a barren wasteland drained of hope and faith. A barren wasteland drained of hope and faith. And this kind of lets you into the defeated and uncertain spirit that so many people had at this time. And writers are a reflection of culture. Think about major literary works throughout history as being something of a mirror that these writers are holding up to get society to take a look at themselves. And so writers of this time are expressing doubts about their traditional religious beliefs, about their about their political beliefs. They are expressing their anxieties and disturbing visions of the present and future, because there's a whole lot of concern that if World War I happened, what's to stop a misguided planet of humans from waging another global war? And so, there are some very famous writers during this time. Probably one of the most famous writers is a guy by the name of Ernest Hemingway. Okay? And so one of the things that happens is we see expatriates during this time. An expatriate is a person living outside of one's own country. And Ernest Hemingway was himself an expatriate, a person who leaves the country that they are from and goes to settle in a place where they are not originally from, in a different country. And so many expatriates at this time were living in Europe and writing about what they saw in the wake of World War I in Europe. And Ernest Hemingway was one of these guys. Ernest Hemingway comes from a particular era of writers called the Lost Generation. And the lost generation refers to a group of people who were born right around the turn of the 20th century. We'll say right around the year 1900 to about 1905, somewhere in that area. They had survived World War I, which, remember, up to that point was the largest global catastrophe that anyone had ever seen in human history before. So they survive World War I. They get done with World War I. They're maybe about 20 years old, okay? By the time that they're 20, they see the devastation of World War I. They see all of these new ideas about politics, the redrawing of the maps of Europe. They see the economic fallout of Germany in the 1920s. And then by the time that they're 29 years old, the stock market crashes in America. And when the stock market crashes, that starts the Great Depression, which was a global, worldwide depression that lasted for nearly 2 decades. Okay, well, not quite 2 decades, maybe about a decade. Okay, the Great Depression was a major global economic crisis. And so they lived through the Great Depression, where they're seeing people go through bread lines, people lose their jobs, people committing suicide, all sorts of different horrible things. And then they get to the time that they're 39 years old, and now World War II is breaking out. You could understand that somebody born in the year roughly 1900, who went through World War I, who went through the Great Depression, who went through World War II, it would be very easy to come to the conclusion of why this group of people is called the Lost Generation. It was a group of people who saw how bad humanity can be. It was a group of people who saw just how devastating war was. It was a group of people who had a real pulse on public sentiment and culture and the sense of loss and uncertainty that this interwar years period of time brought along with it. And, the sad part of the story is that Ernest Hemingway himself was a man who struggled. This is Ernest Hemingway when he was a young man, and that's him later on in his life. But Ernest Hemingway suffered his entire life with depression and alcoholism. And ultimately, he shot himself. And, it's really, truly beyond tragic, because Ernest Hemingway was an incredibly talented literary figure, but was not immune from the tremendous sense of loss and uncertainty and heartache that came with all of these events that he witnessed that showcased just how awful humans can be to one another and just how difficult society is. You think about how lost you'd feel to go through all of these terrible events. World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, it would make you feel lost too. By the end of it all, you'd be looking at humanity and asking yourself, what's the point? If people are just destined to be irrational and go to war with one another and kill each other, and all of these, and the greed, the corporate greed, and the stock market crash, and starving, and bread lines, and depression, and all of these things, joblessness, and people start losing a sense of meaningfulness about the world. What's the point if humans are just going to be destructive, And so people are really asking themselves some very heavy questions about their existence. What's the meaning of it? What's the meaning of it all? You could understand why people would ask those kinds of questions. It seemed in this time, for such a long period of time, a solid 40 years there at the start of the 20th century, from about 1910 to about 1950 or so, we've seen some of the worst things happen to mankind, you know? And they start to ask questions about their existence, and that's where we get into existentialism. So now we've talked about some changes in literature, the lost generation. There are some very famous books that are written during this time about the war and the effect that it had on society. But now let's move into some philosophy. So we've talked about physics, we've talked about psychology, study of human mental processes and behaviors. We've looked at literature. Let's talk about some philosophy, some meaning of life stuff. And the school of philosophy known as existentialism really rose into prominence during the interwar years. Existentialism, the root word of it is exist, okay, or existence, right? And so what we're really asking here is, what's the point of existence? What is the significance of human existence here on the planet? The existentialists believed that people were in a constant search for meaning in an uncertain world. And one of the most famous philosophers of the existentialist movement is Jean-Paul Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre was a French philosopher. He helped to create the school of existentialism in philosophy, along with other existentialist thinkers such as Soren Kierkegaard and other people like that. But nonetheless, Jean-Paul Sartre basically claims that there is no universal meaning to life. And again, this is kind of a new idea for this time. You know, when people ask that question, what's the meaning of life? Usually they don't ask it in a serious sense, okay? But maybe you have ever wondered to yourself, what is the meaning of life? What the existentialists would tell you is that there is no singular answer to that question. That the meaning of life is not universal. That people's lives have different meanings to them precisely because each person creates his or her own meaning through their choices and through their actions. So what is the meaning of life is a question that is the answer to that question is entirely dependent on the person that you're asking. You know, for some people, the meaning of life might be to become a wonderful mother or father, okay, and raise a family. For another person, the meaning of life might be to live on the side of a mountain and, you know, whatever, come up with new cooking recipes all day long or something. I don't know. Maybe another person's meaning of life is to own a hot dog stand somewhere in Los Angeles, okay? There's no universal meaning to life. People's own meaning is derived from what you create meaning out of. And the reason that that is so significant is because in order to truly understand existentialism, you have to come to terms with the idea that that universally everything is essentially meaningless. If there is no universal meaning to life, that means that in some sense everything is itself meaningless to someone or another. But to one person, what might be meaningless could be meaningful to another. Okay? So, but that's really a startling thing. It's a startling thing because when you say, well, nothing is inherently meaningful. Everything, you know, everything is meant to die, or everything is meant to come to an end, or whatever. Even the earth, okay? But but at the same time, it also liberates you. Because once you come to terms with the utter meaninglessness of everything, only then can you begin to start making your own meaning. And if you take my life as an example, right? Who am I? I can't speak for you. I can't speak for anyone in this class. I can't speak for anyone other than myself in terms of the things that bring me meaning. But what brings me meaning changes throughout my life, you know? Recently, what are the things that I get meaning out of? I enjoy going out and working in my garage and working on these little restoration projects that I do. I enjoy making music, you know, that no one listens to. And in some sense, that's okay. No one has to listen to it to make it good or to validate my experience or anything like that, right? I do it because I find meaning in it, because I enjoy doing it, because it makes me feel like I have a creative outlet or like I'm doing something or whatever, okay? But to somebody else, they'd be like, what are you, nuts? You know, you're spending all this time making music, who cares? And that's okay, because maybe to them, they're not interested in that. Maybe to them, they're interested in something else, right? But the whole idea is you want to find things that to you do it just because you enjoy doing it. And that should be the meaning of life. You make meaning. You don't go and find meaning, you create it. And that's what the existentialists are talking about, okay? That existence is completely defined by you, okay? Your existence, your meaning, the things that bring your existence meaning are determined by you, not by anyone else. And if you go out into the world and you're trying to find meaning, you're going to have a real hard time finding it because you're going to be in a constant search for it. It's only when you sit down and you recognize, hey, this cup of coffee that I'm drinking right now is meaningful to me. It might not mean anything to anyone else, but I like it and I'm enjoying it, and that's okay, you know? Those kinds of ideas. Here's Jean-Paul Sartre. Many existentialist thinkers during this time were influenced by a German philosopher by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche was not an existentialist. He was part of a different school of philosophy known as nihilism, which is very close to the word annihilate, okay? When we think about nihilism, nihilism is a little bit more grim view of the meaning of life, in a sense. One of the famous lines from Friedrich Nietzsche's writings in the late early 1900s was, he wrote, "God is dead." And this was a reference to the fact that not because he was trying to get people to become more religious or anything like that. The reason that he said it had more to do with his evaluation of the fact that humanity was in some sense destined to destroy itself. You know, and that here's the thing about Friedrich Nietzsche. He's not an easy guy to understand. Friedrich Nietzsche basically snapped one day. It's a really tragic story. Friedrich Nietzsche was a brilliant, brilliant man, but he basically snapped. His sister essentially took him after he had this mental break, and she basically put him on display in her backyard, and he was just, you know, this almost comatose, sort of drooling guy. He had an aneurysm or something, and his sister basically charged people to come and look at the once great Friedrich Nietzsche philosopher, who now is sitting in a stupor in her backyard. It was really, really sad. And he ended up dying relatively young. But these ideas, okay, basically about Western democracy, reason, progress, all of these ideas are what Nietzsche initially said were actually slowing down human creativity and slowing down the capacity for humans to reach their highest potential. And he wanted humanity to return to more ancient values like pride, assertiveness, strength, and so on. And so these ideas from Friedrich Nietzsche definitely influenced the philosophers that came after him during the existentialist movement of the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. Let's talk about art. There were a number of changes in art at this time. Artists were rebelling against the previous art style that had been very, very famous or popular during the late 1800s, which was realism. Realism was a style of art that depicted the world as people saw it. Now, when we say realist art, a lot of times when people describe art, they will mistakenly use the word realistic to describe it. And the reason that they're mistakenly doing that is because, to be honest, the realist art form is not something that you would look at and be like, oh my gosh, it looks so real, I can't even tell whether or not this is a photo or whether this is a painting. That's not the kind of realism that we're talking about. That's photorealism. That's a different kind of art. That's when people draw or paint things so realistically that you sometimes can't even tell whether you're looking at a photograph or at a piece of art. Okay? However, when we talk about realist art looks like a painting. You're not going to confuse it with a photo. But the content, the subject matter of the piece that you're looking at is something that you would see happen in real life. So for example, if I was to pull up here, I'll pull up this tab and just type in realist art. Okay, realist art. This is an example of realist art. Okay, why is this real? Well, one second. Let me do this here. Cancel. This is an example of realist art here. You can see it on my screen. Okay, are you going to confuse this with a photo? No, but why is it realist art? Because these are just regular people, farmers, working in a field somewhere. Another example of realist art would be like this one here. Why is it realist art? Because these guys are just regular road workers. They're just regular people. This guy's carrying a rock. They obviously have some tools here. These are just regular everyday folks. Realist art has a tendency to depict everyday kind of common scenes. And that style of art, realist art, falls out of favor after World War I. And increasingly, we're seeing much more abstract forms of art that are trying to depict emotion, that are trying to depict imagination, that break the conventional rules of artwork that had been followed up to this point. So for example, Cubism is one of these styles of abstract art that starts to emerge during this time period. Cubism is where natural forms, like I just showed you, where people are depicted proportionally, they look real, they have dirty hair, they have scars on their face and so on, they look like real people, and instead they transform them into geometric shapes with sharp edges and angles and radical color schemes and things like that. Another style of art that came about during this time is known as surrealism. Surrealism is very much inspired actually by Sigmund Freud, who, because Sigmund Freud was trying to tap into people's unconscious minds using things like dreams and stuff like that, Freud was very much a believer that people's dreams could reveal things about their personality, could reveal unconscious motivations of why they are the way they are. And so we started to see the depiction of dreamscapes, okay, mixed with reality depicted in art by artists such as Salvador Dali. So here you have Cubist art. This is a famous Cubist piece by Pablo Picasso. You've probably heard of Picasso before. He's probably the best known Cubist artist of this time period. And you can see how the natural forms of these three musicians here have been turned into these radical, sharp-angled geometric shapes. And again, why is this art? Most people would look at this and say, wow, this doesn't look anything like the kinds of art that I'm used to back in the 1920s. But the idea was that's exactly why it's art. It's depicting things in a completely different way. And it's meant to get people to look at it and think about it. And that's what good art is supposed to do. And so these radical shapes here and how these musicians are, kind of disembodied from their natural figure and turned into these geometric shapes is how Cubist art depicts creativity and emotion through the piece. Here you can see an example of Surrealist art. This is a very, very famous painting that you probably have seen before. It's called The Persistence of Memory. A lot of people call it the Melting Clocks painting, although that is not its official title. It's called The Persistence of Memory. But you can see how, once again, as I mentioned, it's almost a blending of a dreamscape with reality. On one level, we see kind of this cliff and an ocean and a beach here, but on the other hand, we have some very absurd features to this art of these melting clocks that are kind of laying on these different unusual things here. There's a pocket watch, and this is yet again another example of just how radical the changes in art are during this time. Another art movement that occurred during the interwar years that is also considered abstract art is called the Les Fauves movement, also known as Fauvism. This was a movement in art by a guy named Henri Matisse. Henri Matisse emphasized strong, bright colors rather than realism. Whereas before, things would have been depicted in a realistic way using the actual colors, using the actual proportions and features of the people in the paintings and stuff. The Les Fauves movement used color in a very radical way. And this is an example of that before I move on to the others. This is a piece by Henri Matisse. Henri Matisse was the best known Les Fauves artist, and sometimes this painting is nicknamed the Green Line. And the reason is because you can see this really bright green line that comes right down the subject's face. Now again, you're not going to look at this painting and think, wow, that looks like an actual photograph of a person. It's not meant to. Okay, this wasn't meant to display people exactly as they were. It was meant to be groundbreaking with these radical, vibrant colors that usually were not found in any art during the realist art movement. And all good, groundbreaking art has a way of somehow introducing elements that were previously not used by other artists. And so you could see why this use of color is so groundbreaking to depict light in the paintings of the Les Fauves artists. Another art style that we see in this time is sometimes called Art Deco. It's less of a painting and drawing style. When we talk about Art Deco, we're usually talking about object design. It's a visual style more than it is an art style. Although you could say that the various pieces of furniture and various other objects, buildings, architecture are definitely art from the Art Deco period. To give you some examples of Art Deco stuff, let me show you down here what I mean. Okay, the best way that I can describe Art Deco is curved but linear. Curved but linear. Let me explain what I mean. This is the Chrysler, or maybe that's the Empire State Building. I think it's the Empire State Building. Okay, this is the Empire State Building, which is architecturally designed in the Art Deco style. When I say curved but linear, what do I mean? Well, you can see a lot of symmetry here. Okay, there are lines. Here's a line, here's a line, here's a line, and it's all nice and symmetrical. However, you can also see curves here. Curves, 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 curves. Okay, yet at the same time, very linear, very symmetrical. All right, this is what Art Deco looks like. Let me give you some other examples of what I mean. Because you can find Art Deco, which happens to be one of my absolute favorite of all artistic visual styles. I actually have a number of pieces of Art Deco furniture in my house because I like it so much. But let me show you another example here. Art Deco car. Okay, images. They were using Art Deco to style vehicles at this time. Let me kind of show you what I mean. Let me give you a really good example. Let's find, I guess that's more of a motorcycle, but these cars are all more or less done in the Art Deco. I can find one for you. I think it's a 1925 Rolls-Royce Phantom. This is a great example of Art Deco in a vehicle. Okay, this is very, very Art Deco. What makes it Art Deco? Well, if we take a look at it, okay, it has these round doors, okay, but at the same time it has lines. You can see these lines here, and then you can also see bold, swooping curves. So it's curved, but yet in some sense very linear too. Again, curved, but this line coming straight down the back, this fin on the back of the car. It's a really awesome looking car, and this is, you know, it's one of the styles of Art Deco. But you could also do Art Deco radio. Okay, take a look at this. Again, curved. You can see some curved features to it, but it's also linear, okay, because these curves are all lined up parallel with one another, okay. Another Art Deco radio could be found here, okay. This one is a little bit more angular, but still you still see some curves in there, but nonetheless very symmetrical, very linear, okay. You can do it with furniture, chair, Art Deco chair, okay. Some of these are good and others are not. Let's see here. Let me find a good example for you of an Art Deco chair. This would be a great example of an Art Deco chair right here. Okay, you see the lines, but at the same time you see some curves. Curved, but linear. All right. Here's another one. Lines, okay, but curved. Okay, curved, but linear. All right, all of these are great examples of Art Deco visual style. Art Deco train, okay? Here's a great example of an Art Deco train. All right, you can see here, it's curved, but linear, okay? It has a certain cool aesthetic to it that we don't see very often anymore. Most famously, you can see a lot of Art Deco in the movie The Great Gatsby. Okay, The Great Gatsby has a lot of Art Deco visual design throughout the whole thing. I'm not really finding a bunch as I pop up right here, but even this border around Leonardo DiCaprio in this poster here is very Art Deco in design. Okay, Lots of buildings, furniture, ships, trains, cars, radios, you name it, were done in the Art Deco visual style. And then the last art style that we'll talk about for today is Dada art, as it's called, Dadaism. Okay, and Dadaism is essentially an artistic protest against World War I, imperialism, cultural conformity, and Dada art famously breaks the bounds of all conventional art, basically breaks every single rule and embraces chaos. The whole point of Art Deco, the whole point of Dada style art is to embrace chaos and irrationality of the human spirit. It rejects logical art. It is sometimes even referred to as anti-art because it is an art style that is extremely radically against the bounds of conformity that previous art styles used. So let me show you some examples of Art Deco, of Dada art. Dada art tends to look very chaotic. You can see here that this piece on the left looks more or less like a bunch of jumbled magazine clippings that have all been put together in this giant collage here. Another piece to the right just goes to show the absurdity of the Dada style of art. It's weird. It's deliberately weird. One of the most famous pieces of the Dada style of art is the fountain. And it was done by an artist by the name of Marcel Duchamp. The fountain, it was a piece put on display in an art museum, but what it was basically a public urinal from a restroom that had been taken and put on display and called fountain. Now, when we think of a fountain, usually we think of like a Palace of Versailles, beautiful fountain with spewing water up, and it's gorgeous and it's got gold plating on it and stuff like that. And here, this one's called fountain, and it's literally a public restroom urinal. Why would Marcel Duchamp take a urinal and put it on display and call it art? Well, being a part of the Dada style of art, he basically said, you know, if humans are rational, reasonable people who value reason, okay, then this is art. Because his whole statement is that humans are actually irrational. And that this piece of art is every bit as much art as anything else because of the supreme uncertainty of this time. And that brings me to the end of the lecture. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.